What if I told you that the sensor in this tiny little camera is the same size as the sensor you'll find in this thing? And then what if I told you that this camera ran Android and was part of Samsung's Galaxy line? This wacky little 12-year-old product might be one of the most quirky and downright fascinating devices I've held in an awfully long time. And I was ecstatic when I got mine in the post. Samsung released this thing way back when the Galaxy S3 was still the hottest phone going. It was back in a time when Android cameras weren't really known to be particularly great. Digital cameras were still popular back in 2012, and back then, companies were in the mindset of hardware being the most important thing because even the best digital cameras didn't have any crazy image processing pipelines. So why should a phone? It would be a few years until Google would come along and essentially turn the whole industry on its head, proving that software processing could do most of the work. It's actually funny because the Galaxy camera runs this OS because Android in its very early development was designed as a camera operating system, but pivoted towards smartphones a little later on. Also, fellas, I'm really trying to hit 100,000 subscribers, so if you wouldn't mind hitting that button, it genuinely would mean the absolute world to me. Thanks guys. There are two different versions of this camera, including a revised second generation that launched in 2014, and actually, more interestingly, a full interchangeable lens camera called the Galaxy NX that offered a larger 20 megapixel APS-C size sensor. But that is a story for another day, and I'm not sure I'm going to be looking at that one because look at the prices on eBay. So what about this then? It's the first generation model called the GC100, and it has a 16 megapixel 1/2.3 inch sensor, like the same size as the original Pixel. It has a massive 21 times optical zoom, so a full frame equivalent of about 23 to 481 millimeters, with an f2.8 to f5.9 maximum aperture. It can shoot 1080p video at 30 fps. It has a 4.8 inch 720p LCD on the back and comes with a whopping 4 or 8 gigabytes of storage that can be expanded with micro SD. You know, the good old way. Before we get into image quality, because I'm 100% comparing it to one of these bad boys, I want to tell you about the quirks and features of the Galaxy camera because it certainly has a few of those. First up is that this camera never really got a whole lot of software updates. It released on Android 4.1 Jelly Bean and it stayed on Android 4.1 Jelly Bean. It runs the infamous TouchWiz interface atop of Android with a measly 1GB of RAM. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, smartwatches in 2024 come with double the RAM that this thing had back in the day. It means that there's not much in the way of performance even if you could find compatible apps and games for this ancient operating system. And it does make sense to have your camera run a smartOS though, as the ability to capture a photo and then instantly share it with your friends is great. It's not a wild concept, it's just you'd figure they'd update the software, right? And then there's the ergonomics. They're actually remarkably good. It weighs about 50% more than your average flagship phone in 2024, but it's obviously way thicker. It is still pocketable to be fair, even in jean pockets, and it has a decent little grip, a 2-stage shutter button with a zoom rocker, and this thing actually feels quite good to use. But what the hell were they smoking when they put the headphone port right up here where your hand goes, the micro USB port just below it, although I guess that makes more sense because you're unlikely to be using it whilst transferring files. But the headphone port? I'm not sure about that. It does have this cute little pop-up flash though if you're into that, which makes a very satisfying noise. Actually, the tactility as a whole is pretty satisfying with the Galaxy camera. The micro HDMI port is under the battery door, which is also pretty wild. And look, it still uses these little batteries that are very similar to the ones we used to have in our smartphones back in the day. Pretty cool. The placement of the home button within the camera app is also another fascinating design decision because I've hit that so many times, probably more times than I've actually hit the shutter button with this thing. And because it's running that ancient hardware under the hood, loading back into the camera app when you've accidentally gone home isn't actually that quick. And if having an absolutely tiny sensor wasn't enough wackiness for you, did you know that this big bulky camera just doesn't shoot RAW photos whatsoever? Pretty much every flagship phone over the past 5 years has been able to in sort of a master or a pro mode. Yep, you're just getting JPEGs out of this thing. Though you can of course adjust the aspect ratio in the camera app and change the resolutions, which is quite handy to have. There is also a full manual mode for adjusting shutter speed, ISO and aperture. So it's not like there are no pro controls at all, but I still find it fascinating that it couldn't shoot RAW photos. Speaking of, the photo taking experience is, let's say, different to what we're used to these days. The camera app itself is pretty clunky, so you won't be changing settings on the fly very quickly whatsoever. And that lack of pace carries over to pressing the shutter button too, where you'll find the lens kind of hunts for a while before capturing the shot, and the noise it makes is quite cute, but it feels very 2000s with this kind of thing. And it's odd because you lose the tactility of a traditional camera, but it also doesn't give you the efficiency and the simplicity that a modern smartphone brings. It's kind of a really awkward worst of both worlds. There's not much in the way of stabilization at the crazy long zooms too, so it's tougher to keep the thing still and not end up with a blurry shot. Also, this little thing in the corner of the Galaxy Ultra is so useful for seeing what part of the frame you're zoomed in on, but it's clearly impossible with the camera because that's zooming in entirely optically, where the phone is actually using a lot more of a crop at this point, and so has the full view so you can pick where you want to go. You'll immediately notice the lack of HDR processing coming from the Galaxy camera's images. They are decidedly old school in their blown out highlights at times and crushed shadows. They aren't bad, but since they aren't in RAW, you also don't have heaps of latitude for adjusting them in post. There is a distinct lack of overall detail, but a noticeable amount of processing sharpness, which is clearly to make the images stand out better on social media and make up for the tiny sensor's shortcomings. This is exacerbated when we compare photos directly with one of Samsung's best ever smartphone cameras, the Galaxy S23 Ultra. I've actually chosen to use it instead of the S24 Ultra as a point of comparison, not only because its main camera is basically the same, but the far-reaching telephoto is actually better on the S23 Ultra once you go past sort of 10, 15, 20 times. The S23 Ultra's main camera is about double the size and over 12 times the resolution at that sort of 24mm-ish wide focal length. You can see the difference most in dynamic range, where the phone is bringing down the highlights and up the shadows to give you more detail across the whole scene. This is the look that most smartphone cameras will give you these days. It's a very heavy HDR look. By comparison, the Galaxy camera's images look far less processed, which you might like, but they also objectively come out a little bit duller and more washed out too, which is interesting, but I guess to be expected. And when we pinch in at 10 times, 15 times, all the way up to 21 times, they are way closer than you would think from a subject sharpness standpoint, and actually look more natural from a subject separation point of view too, with the S23 Ultra's photos seemingly having a lot more in focus, but then you just realise it's a lot of post-processing going on to compensate for the 10 megapixel sensor. I feel like we shouldn't compare video here because that's just unfair, but yeah, you can see for yourself in the samples, smartphones have become incredibly good at shooting video, and the proof in the pudding is in the tasting. The plucky little Galaxy camera clearly represents what we used to think smartphone cameras would turn out like, and it falls short as a result, but I still love it regardless. I'm sure this would be a really interesting base for someone to craft a more powerful OS for. I'm not sure how viable that is, but I don't know, it'd be really cool to see it, and they're only about 100 quid on eBay at the moment, so if you're a dev and you're interested, please give it a go. The Galaxy camera is one of the most fascinating artifacts of a bygone era. It was a really strange transition point between family cameras and smartphones taking over, and I'm so glad I got to try one out.